Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this evening for the presentation of the recently completed capital needs assessment here at Bishop's Forest. The meeting this evening is being recorded and will be uploaded to our Bishop's Forest channel on YouTube in a few days. The capital needs assessments or reserve studies are required to be completed periodically and provides information necessary for a homeowners association to make critical decisions about future funding needs. It helps to avoid frequent large assessments on unit owners by anticipating large-scale costs such as roof replacement, siding, paving, decking, and more. A typical reserve study includes both physical analysis, inspecting the current condition of the common areas and the infrastructure, and financial analysis and anticipating future funding needs. Tonight, we'd like to keep the discussion centered on the reserve study, the methodology, and the study's conclusions. The information we receive from this study and the recommendations it provides are important factors as the board considers preparing for future financial needs and implementation of the budget for next year. The next step will be the presentation of the draft budget for unit owners, consideration and comment at our December 8th meeting. This is not an appropriate time or place to discuss pet peeves, specific maintenance or landscaping concerns, or vendor issues. Those questions and concerns are best left to our December 8th budget meeting or any monthly trustees meeting. In May, we contracted Advanced Reserve Solutions and Paul Hewing to conduct our reserve study and provide prioritized maintenance needs as well as funding options. Paul is a graduate of Cornell University with a bachelor's and master's degree in mechanical engineering. He is a licensed professional engineer and holds Massachusetts construction supervisor and home improvement contractor licenses with over 30 years of construction and engineering experience. He is a member of the Community Associations Institute of New England and contributes numerous articles to their website. So with that, I'd like to introduce Paul Hewing and ask him to begin his presentation.
All right, well, thank you very much. I'll share my screen. And let's see here. Okay. So can everyone see?
Yep, we got you.
The presentation. Somehow my view of everyone got minimized, but let me just see. So anyway, probably it makes sense to save questions for the end, mostly because we're doing this virtually. So what I plan to do is just go through what a reserve study is, some specifics about Bishop's Forest, what I looked at. Those are the largest items that I looked at. Some list of expenses that I developed in cooperation with the board and with John Scarpese, the property manager, and then some potential funding plans that would address the expenses that were sort of developed through the study. So can everyone see the title page?
We can.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so here is my contact information. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. I think I can just skip that. So the reserve study process, funding the association capital responsibilities is really a three-part process, at least for the initial part of it. It's a experienced property condition evaluation. So I toured the property in June, I believe, and spent a very long day there looking at all of the interior and exterior components that were on a prior reserve study. This was an update of a prior reserve study. And then I ended up adding more components and refining components based on what I saw. It seeks to create an organized funding approach, which is based on all of the responsibilities of the association over time, and then present that information in a readable format that most owners should be able to understand with some minor guidance. So what is the importance of a reserve fund? Having adequate reserves is critical to maintaining a stable and attractive community. It is funded by a fair distribution of yearly depreciation of common components. So every year your roof is 1 year older, and if a roof lasts 25 years, you should be contributing 1/25 of the cost of a roof into the fund. So at the end of the 25-year period, the money is in the fund to replace the roof, as an example. The study assumes that components are maintained in a adequate reserves allow components to be maintained in a cost-effective manner. That you're not needing to defer maintenance that will lead to larger costs in the future. And the study really seeks to give a sustainable and predictable financial structure for the association that both the board and unit owners can rely on to have a more predictable and sustainable path to the future. So in short, the reserve study really is a roadmap to sustainability from a financial and physical point of view for the association. There are limitations in a reserve study. We make certain assumptions. For instance, we assume that components are installed correctly. That doesn't mean that if we know that components are not installed correctly, we can adjust for that in the study. But given if we're not told about issues, we assume that the roofing, siding is installed properly, for example. We assume equipment is operational and that equipment and other components are maintained as recommended by manufacturers. After that walkthrough that I did, I make my best estimates on the condition and the remaining useful life of the components. And overall, no one can predict the future perfectly. So discrepancies between when I think things might be needing to be replaced and when they are actually replaced will be inevitable. But overall, in general, it should be a useful planning tool. So based on the construction date of 1989, the community is sort of in its midlife maintenance. So you're about 34, 35 years old. The initial 20-year period after construction has passed and you're in major replacements of components that last about 20, 25 years. What's not covered, we're talking about exteriors of buildings. And on the exterior, the unit owners are responsible for windows and doors. I would highly recommend that the association create some specification to ensure that these windows and doors are, first of all, compatible with the aesthetics of the community, but also that they're installed properly and flashed properly so as to protect the rest of the building, which is a common responsibility. So the largest capital drivers of the reserve fund are asphalt areas replacing roads, roofs, which are in the middle of a big roofing project, exterior siding, which is an ongoing project for you, and decks and balconies. So we're going to look at each of those in a little more detail. So there are, I'll show you a list of expenditures shortly on the next slide here, but there are consistent large expenditures in most years. The highest annual expenses occur in 2035 and then the time period of 2043 through 50. And if components in general age well, some expenditures in the reserve study may be delayed. Other components may not age well and may need to be replaced sooner. But the reserve study is recommended to be updated periodically. Typically, the recommendation would be 2 to 4 years. It can be updated to include new pricing, which is changing very rapidly today, or in the times we live in. And also an inflation assumption could be changed if hopefully it gets under control and back to the sort of 2 to 3% level that is the target of the Federal Reserve. So this is most of the first page of the annual expenditure detail. The full study is hopefully available to look at, but this expense list for the 30 years goes on probably, let's see, about 15 pages or so. The board can use this list kind of on a rolling 5-year time period to look at what's coming up over the next 0 to 5 years. And you can see that next year, there's projected to be expenses of almost $1.6 million based on the items that are on this list. So I mentioned the largest capital drivers. Roadways are one of them. Bishop's Forest Drive, the asphalt has definitely exceeded its typical useful life and is really in remarkably good condition for being 30 years old or so. And so that's an indicator that soil conditions are good at the site, and that has allowed me to schedule the next replacement further into the future. The projected cost for the replacement, which is expected in 2025, is $251,000. That's an inflated cost to 2025. And other roads that are on the horizon are Overlook, which is expected in 2027, Morningside in 2030, and Wayside in 2041. So you'll have a gap of about 10 years with your roads based on roads that were done in recent years. Asphalt cost is heavily dependent on the cost of oil. So these costs need to be kind of examined over time and adjusted in future reserve study updates if hopefully the price of oil goes down again. Roofs are on the current and intermediate time horizon. There are 2 more years of Woodbury roofs that are going to be completed in 2023 and 2024. And you can see the amounts there on the slide of roughly $750,000 over the 2 years. And then there'll be a lull in the roofing program, and it'll start up again in 2029 with roofs that were replaced in the early 2000s. Annual inspections and maintenance of roofs is highly recommended and can solve lots of small problems and enable your roofs to last longer, hopefully, than what we are anticipating. Exterior siding is a third large driver of expenses. Your wood siding is generally in good condition, I would say, based on my tour, and comparing it to other associations. Wood siding is repaired on a 6-year paint cycle. So total repairs and replacements for the current year 6-year cycle is about $2.3 million. And about 20% of the siding area is expected to be addressed during this upcoming 6-year project. Overall, siding conditions should be evaluated as the buildings continue to age, and that percentage of siding replacement and repair can be updated in future reserve study updates to reflect actual conditions moving forward. Right now, there is no budget for complete replacement of siding because I did not feel it was necessary based on the condition and the aggressive repair schedule that you have, but that assumption should be evaluated in future updates. So deck refurbishment and ongoing deck maintenance is another large capital driver, the fourth one that we're going to talk about today briefly. There's a project that's going to start in 2024 or scheduled to start in 2024, which will replace the decking on the existing framework and the top cap of railings. It does include an allowance for some structural repairs on each deck as needed. And that total project is $1.3 million over 10 years. So the plan is to start in 2024 and finish in 2023 with a refurbishment of all of the decks. Outside of that project, there's also a budget for deck inspections and repairs that will need to be going on during this time frame and also beyond this time frame, just for to fix minor issues. All right, now we're going to look at that was sort of the background of the expense side of the reserve study. Now we're going to look at some of the results and look at some of the funding side of how we're going to pay for all of this. So this is the top half of the executive summary page that's in the reserve study, and it lists some important assumptions that can be adjusted over time as conditions in the overall economy change and as potentially conditions within the associations change. So that right now the inflation rate I'm assuming is 3.5%, which is lower than the actual inflation rate right now, but higher than the long-term goal of the Federal Reserve. So this inflation rate, I can only set one rate for the whole 30-year period with the software that I use. So it will need to be updated over time hopefully towards the downside, because small changes in inflation rate have a very large impact on future expenses, and therefore the money that needs to be collected to pay those future expenses. Your investment rate on your reserve funds is about 0.5%. You pay some taxes, and there's a 3% contingency on built in to the reserve calculations. The adequacy of reserves on January 1st of 2023. So the study actually starts next year, the beginning of next year. At the end of 2022, the reserve fund is estimated to be in a deficit position, and that has been accounted for in the reserve study. So right now, the present value or the current value of all of your assets that are included in the reserve fund is approaching $9 million. And by the end of this year, your fund will be in a deficit position based on the input that I've gotten. So the planned funding level for next year, before the surgery was done, was $757,000, which is an increase from this year, and about $235 per average unit per month. So the next slide I'm going to show you is how that $757,000 addresses the expenses that are expected based on my evaluation and then discussions with the board. So the current funding, which is also increasing at the assumed inflation rate of 3.5%, will unfortunately result in the need for a special assessment in 2023 to cover anticipated shortfall. So this is a table or spreadsheet of what will happen given the expenditures. So the annual expenditures that I showed you a partial list of a few slides back that listed roads and siding and other things, fire hydrants and other components that need to be replaced in 2023. If you add all the 2023 numbers together, you get about that $1.6 million. You're starting with zero, actually less than zero. And you're contributing $757,000, which is the plan. So you're going to end up in this column with a negative number and negative ending balance, unfortunately. So this is something that the board has been working on for quite some time to figure out how to address. And the goal tonight is to give you a kind of an overview of different ways of doing that, so that over the coming weeks, the association can come up with a plan to address the funding gap. So what I did is I started with that plan of what you were going to contribute next year, which is not going to be enough. And I have several options that I'm going to show you tonight on how to address that. This is the minimal funding option, which is not recommended, but it basically seeks to keep the fund solvent and eliminate its special assessments over time. Now, there's still a risk of special assessments in low % funded years. So in this plan, there is a $3 million assessment in 2023, which is a very large number. It's $11,000 per average unit. It is a catch-up contribution basically for the funds that are not in the fund, in the reserve fund now, to pay for expenses that are expected next year. And then increasing the regular contribution from that $757,000 to $1 million, and that goes up 3.5%. So we were at, I think, $235 per average unit per month for the regular contribution in 2023 that was planned. So in this minimal plan that I have developed, it goes up about $65 or $75 per month. Just the regular funding. Unfortunately, the assessment is on top of that. But this plan will attain 30% funding after 30 years, and I'll show you the beginnings of it. I can't show the whole page because you wouldn't be able to read it. It would be too small, but it is in the in a funding letter that I sent to the board that they have. But this in the last slide with the current planned funding, all of these numbers were negative as a % funded, and the ending balances were negative. So let me explain what a % funded is really telling you. So in this case, on 2023, you start out with zero. You're contributing $4 million to get out of the hole. 1 million is a regular contribution that's increasing at 3.5%, and then a $3 million special assessment. Now, these are just these are plans that I have come up with to start the discussion, basically. So it's not been decided how to address the funding issue. But here you can see that it does, fund what's needed, and there's going to be $2.5 million left over, which is about 29% of the amount of money that should be in your fund. So the percent funded number here, the 29%, is the ratio of how much is in your fund to how much should be in your fund if the annual depreciation each year was put into that fund. So if you had only one component in your study and its life was 10 years and the cost was $10,000, you would be 100% funded if you put $1,000 a year in for the 10 years. So at the end of the 10 years, you have $10,000 and you can pay to replace whatever that component is. So in year one, if you have $1,000 at the end of the year, you're 100% funded because that's paying for that 1 year of depreciation. The same in year two. If you have $2,000, that's paying for 2 years of depreciation. So the program looks at all of the components, and they're well over 100, and says how much should be in the fund based on that annual depreciation that has occurred already. That's where this $8,500,000 number comes from. So with this potential scenario, if you contribute $4 million this coming year, you will end up with about a third of what you would ideally have in your reserve fund. So an intermediate, so this percent funded is sort of an insurance policy, if you will. The higher the percent funded is, the less likely it is that you would need any future special assessments. So with this $4 million cash infusion in 2023 and your $1 million regular contribution going up at 3.5%, you're kind of going along, kind of bumping along the 20% mark for a number of years. And then in 2035, which is a high expense year of $2.9 million, you go back down to 12, which leaves a fairly low balance in the fund. So that when you have low percent funded, you have a higher risk of running out of money, basically. So that's a risk for this plan, which is why it's really not recommended, but it's just for illustration purposes. An intermediate funding level plan that I developed has reduced risk of special assessments after the initial special assessments. There's really no way to get around special assessments unless the association were to get a loan, or maybe it's a combination, but that's kind of going to be beyond the scope of the reserve study and more in the implementation of what the expenses are that we've developed. So in this scenario, there's a $2 million assessment in 2023, a $1 million assessment in 2024, and a $500,000 assessment in 2025. In addition, the regular contribution is bumped up to $1.1 million. So in the last scenario, there was a $3 million single assessment and a $1 million regular contribution. So the assessment is spread out and also slightly increased. And then your regular contribution is increased now to $341 a month versus a $235. So it's $106 more than what was planned for 3. And this plan will attain 55% funded after 30 years, which is pretty good, and certainly a goal that many associations would choose. So this you can see on this plan, which is the sort of the spreadsheet. It starts out at 18% and then slowly goes up pretty continuously to 55%, and then it ends at 50% if you add the years between 2042 and 2052. So this is a reasonable plan that could be considered and would be one that maybe a middle of the road association might adopt. There's a wide variety of what associations do adopt, but this one after the first couple of years would have much less likelihood of additional special assessments than the prior minimal plan that was just shown. I always show the recommended plan, which is sort of the Cadillac plan for all practical purposes. That plan is never chosen by associations in New England, but it is, I just put it in there to illustrate what it would take. So in this case, the special assessments are the same as the last scenario, the intermediate scenario, but the regular contribution is increased from 1.1 to 1.3 million, which increases your contribution to $403 per month and $168 above where you are now. And this will attain 100% funding after 30 years. Again, it's not one that's not a scenario that's likely to be chosen, but it's in there to just show you the breadth of what the options are. So in this case, you can see that these numbers very quickly get above 50% and into sort of the green zone where you're above 63% or so, and it ends up at 100 after 30 years. So again, this is an option that's just really more for illustration purposes. Very few associations and it would end up choosing this option, but it does happen occasionally. So in conclusion, a reserve study is a guide, not a guarantee. Expenditures will differ from the plan and unexpected expenses will likely happen. And because no one can predict exactly what's going to happen and not every potential expense is included in the reserve study, a higher percent funding on those spreadsheet pages results in less risk because your association is more able to absorb an unexpected expense and then pay for it over time rather than needing to immediately go back to the membership to ask for more money. So thank you very much for selecting me to perform your reserve study. My goal is to create a partnership with the association for a sustainable future. So now certainly we are open to questions. I don't know exactly how that's going to be handled, but I'm available.
So we are going to take questions. There is a button on your screen to raise your hand virtually, okay? I can't tell you exactly where it is because different devices do it in different ways, but you all have one. So if you push the button to raise your hand, we will unmute you and allow you to be able to ask your question and interact here. We do have over 80 people on the call, and so you might have to have a little bit of patience as we find you here. Also, if you put your question in the chat, we'll do our best to get to them all as well. Despite any conspiracy theories, it is always my intention to read every single question in the chat. So if I get below you and have missed you, put it in again. It means that it just got buried. But we'll try to get to all of them. So I see some hands up now. Louise, I am unmuting you.
Hello, thank you so much for taking my question. Hello to all my neighbors and fellow residents. I just wanted to tell you that for about 9 years now, I have been submitting a request to regrade my walkway. Why? Because it's dangerous. It goes down about 5 inches, right down, about 5 inches down at the steps that I go up to the door. And every winter, there's a huge slab of ice, which I cannot step over. And I just find that the fact that it has been refused so many times to fix, it's gotten to the point where I'm very frustrated. Also, my neighbor's walkway was completely regraded and put the bricks back on in a better way years after I had first applied, almost as soon as they had moved in. And I don't understand denying those kinds of things when safety is a concern. So I wanted to ask you about that.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I do want everyone to know this meeting is about the reserve study. And while certainly these financial issues could come into play on whether a request is approved or denied, and how maintenance issues move forward. Specific issues like that should be at a regular board meeting. There's a budget meeting coming up on December 8th, where we'll be actually allocating funds for issues like this. That's the perfect time for a question like that. We have over 80 people on this call, and I'd like to ask you to please focus on the reserve study, the methodology, the conclusions, and that's the tool that's being used as we look at the next meeting at the budget and how we'll put that together and proceed. In that budget, we'll look specifically at how we fund different elements, how we prioritize what we're going to work on in the future. So thank you very much for that question. And Shelley White. Unmuted.
Hi, I'm here, Shelley and Jonathan White and our neighbor Lamine. So we're just here together. And we came up with two questions. One is we were trying to understand how it is that we got to 0 in the reserves, like based on prior, assessments and estimation of condo fees and so forth. So that's our first question. And the second was, how does Bishop's Forest 2 factor in terms of getting us to a level position? Because that is obviously a part of the revenue share for our common services like the pool and tennis courts. Thank you. And thank you for the informative presentation.
Thank you for the question. When it comes to Bishop's Forest 2, they pay a percentage.
Yes.
And so whether costs go up or down, their contribution varies. So
A percentage of the work that's done in the common area.
that's right.
That falls under the agreement. There's an agreement with Bishop's Forest 2, and they pay a percentage of whatever common area work that we do that's associated with something that they also have access to. So, main roads, pool work, that kind of stuff.
Paul, do you have anything that you want to add that would illuminate how we got to this situation, or how boards typically end up in a situation where they need this kind of funding?
Well, I think that the short answer is it's really in two parts. One is costs have gone up a lot lately, a tremendous amount in the last year or year and a half. And secondly, basically not enough money was collected, or the prior study wasn't accurate, or one of those two things. And I was mostly focusing on the future rather than the past. But in most of the associations that I look at, they don't collect enough money prior to me being there. They may or may not collect enough money after I'm there. That's something I don't always find out. So I don't have a lot of comment on that. I will say that in the reserve study, the components that are shared with Bishop Forest 2 have a percentage on the actual page of that component. And the percentage varies a little bit for various parts of the community, but that is factored into the study, that only the share of Bishop Forest is what was presented tonight.
Yep, good.
Thank you.
And Suzanne Frank has a question.
Yes, thank you for acknowledging me. I have a question for Paul. Paul, I might not have understood you correctly, but did you say that the painting cycle is every 5 years, or?
I believe it's 6 years.
So I have a question. Does anybody here who owned a house paint their house every 6 years? I don't know anybody that paints their house every 6 years.
Are you saying that's too frequent?
I think so.
I don't. I mean, 6 years is a good cycle. If you wait longer, you're going to have to do more repairs typically. So I usually recommend 6 years to my clients. You were on the 6-year cycle before I got involved.
We were actually on a 5-year cycle, and then we increased it to.
Okay, well, as far as I know, you were on a 6-year cycle as it was presented to me.
I'm questioning that that's really a valid cycle to be on for painting.
I think it is. I think if you wait longer, you're going to have a lot more preparation work and higher costs in the long run.
Or
And
maybe,
Paul, in your experience, what would be the industry standard? What's typical for?
I think it's 6 years for our area. Yes. You know, but it depends on what material you have too. I mean, if you have fiber cement, that can be a longer interval. But for wood siding, 6 years is pretty typical.
And do we paint or stain? Or is our siding painted every 5 or 6 years or stained?
It's painted. So I'll take that. This is Richard. Yeah, so the contract for painting for the last number of years was 6 years. A few years ago, in concert with working on the painting, the siding and the roofing project, and some previous board experiences in talking with Prime Touch, our prime contractor for painting, it was recommended that we go to an 8-year cycle. So we've done that, and it has not been beneficial. We're actually going to bring in the original Woodbury for next year was scheduled for 2 years, but because of the condition of the paint, Morningside, because of the condition of the paint in Morningside, and we didn't, which is going to be at 8 years next year, we didn't want to let it go for another 9th year. So once we kind of catch up on Morningside, and then I believe Woodbury's after that, we're going to go back to a 6-year cycle.
So
It just doesn't last. It doesn't last beyond 6 to 7 years.
do we use paint or do we use stain?
It's painted. It's spray painted on. Spray.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank-
Roberta, I'm unmuting you.
Hi, with the increasing frequency of natural disasters, the building materials are getting more expensive and will continue to be that way. So the 3% inflation seems low for the materials. So the only remedy for that would be to either pay more or to change to longer lived technologies like metal roofs and composite siding.
Okay.
Did we lose?
Paul, do you have a comment on that?
Oh, sure. So yeah, the inflation rate, again, I can only pick one, and it's trying to attempt to predict the average inflation rate over the coming 30 years. So certainly it's too low for right now. A lot of, at least the price increases that have happened in the last 1.5 to 2 years are included as current costs in the study. So that has been taken into account for the large increases in building materials over the last couple of years. Hopefully it'll slow down. I mean, with the Federal Reserve aggressively raising interest rates, construction is going down, and hopefully prices will come down somewhat, or at least slow their rate of increase. That's something that is impossible to predict with any real certainty, and that's a reason to update your study over time to see, update current pricing and the inflation rate. As far
After
as
after every major hurricane, there are shortages of building materials,
right,
and that's not really an inflation. That's the new reality.
well, I mean, I guess something like that could be incorporated, but as of right now, natural disasters are not included in reserve studies.
We have a question in the chat. A resident wants to know when the last reserve study was completed.
I believe, do you know that answer to that, John?
Yeah, the last reserve study was in 2014, and the one prior to that was in 2004.
Okay. So it's roughly 8 years, which I would argue, I mean, it's I'm biased, obviously, is too long of a time period.
We have a question from Ganapathy. I hope I'm saying that correctly.
Yes, you did good.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Paul, for the presentation. My question was about how you assessed risk for the whole community. Did you place the whole community under one risk category, or there are more granular assessment of risk? And the reason I'm asking this is because if we were to consider the more high priority areas and sort of build the fund more gradually to address the high risk, the potentially high risk areas first, and then more gradually build up the fund, maybe more financially also more tolerable. I do understand the correlation between the higher percentage funding and the risk, and your point
Sure.
is, but the more granular assessment of risk might potentially sort of make this a little bit more of less of a steeper curve in building the reserve funds. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but I think how I would address the question, at least initially, and tell me if this doesn't answer it, or at least approach the answer, is if you take a look at the expense list that's generated, then the board, with input from the community, can potentially prioritize. Most of them are things that need to be done in a timely manner to prevent further degradation of whatever the component might be. But some of them, it's not many in your instance, I would say, are more aesthetic and potentially could be postponed and stretch that expense list further out into the future. It's a very detailed list, and I would certainly encourage you to examine it and maybe come up to the consensus with everybody or at least most people, of what things the community can postpone and which things they can't. So certainly roofs, I think, are something that is a necessity. Redoing potentially the pool deck surface, which is rough and is causing problems, maybe that's less something that can be postponed. These are just things that I'm thinking of. It's not necessarily what I would do, but so if you look through those expenses, there will be a small percentage of them that could potentially be postponed, but most would be better off being done in a timely manner so you don't end up with more costly repairs later. Does that address your question?
I'm sorry, he is muted again.
He did give me there's a thumbs up in his box
Oh,
there.
good. All right, thank you, because
Thank you.
I'm struggling with people to find people quickly. In the chat, we have a comment that we hear from a number of people. Large increases in condo fees hurt resale value. I prefer multiple annual assessments instead. Another comment, the reserve study clearly shows we are spending more than we have to spend. There are large expenses missing. Pump, pool, bridge, tennis courts. Why are they not in the study?
Or I'll address that last one. They are in the study. So the pool pumps are in there. The bridge is in there. I would encourage everyone to look through the expense list, and if there's something missing, then it can be added. But I think it's a pretty comprehensive list. In terms of large condo fees affecting property values, I think that's certainly a valid concern. The flip side of that is more buyers are getting more savvy in buying into communities, so that they will want to see a reserve study and they'll want to see how the reserve study is, so that they don't get stuck with an assessment a year or two down the road that forces them to pay for things that should have been saved for in the past. So it's a balancing act. And again, that's where the meetings and sort of consensus building, hopefully for the community, will come up with a level that satisfies, hopefully, a majority, but certainly of the people, that you're spending enough to keep property values and maintain the attractiveness of the community, and not overspending to drive the fees up too high. And that's a balance that the community has to come up with.
We've had rather infrequent assessments here at Bishop's Forest. The number of assessments that we've had in the past, does that look about typical for a community our size, or how would we rank among those communities with which you've worked?
I have not seen what the schedule for assessments was in the past, so I can't really comment on it.
Okay. Ally had a question? You're in.
Yes, so that was actually the question you read about condo fee and resale value. That was my question. But as a follow-up to that, is there, I mean, between the two plans that you provided, minimal plan and intermediate plan, is there a way we can keep the condo fee like at, you know, like the minimal plan, $60, but the special assessment be broken up instead of like, you know, maybe even make it a little more, but break it up like $5,000 for the 3 years, you know what I mean? And keep
Sure.
the condo fee lower and increase
Well,
the special assessment.
yeah, I think that's the discussion moving forward with how you want to balance those two. And certainly the special assessments can be stretched out over any number of years that you want. And the goal is that if somebody reads the, you know, and then that funding plan can be put in the final version of the study. So if you want to have increased contributions for the next 6 years, let's say, and reduce them initially, that's certainly possible if it meets the expense list. And once the reserve study is, once the community agrees on what the plan is, and once the study is final, then that can be handed to potential owners as well as current owners. And as long as everyone knows what's coming down the road, so in terms of expenses, then they can fairly judge what, you know, whether they want to buy into the community if you're an outside person going to buy in, or if you're someone that's in the community you want to sell, you'll know what the expenses are moving forward.
All right,
certainly,
thank you.
certainly can be changed.
Yeah, thank you. But just so you know, condo fee will jump at them immediately, people that are looking at places
Right.
to buy.
Sure.
Versus, you know, looking at the reserve, they may or they may not do, or, you know, it's
Sure.
it's lower probability, but thanks for the response. I'm done.
You're welcome. I mean, I think more and more people are looking at the reserve adequacy, but certainly some won't. And that's, again, you know, kind of luck if you're the seller.
We have a question in the chat. What is the process for vendor contractor due diligence, and how are vendors evaluated? That's an excellent question, but not a question that's really relevant to the reserve study. And I would urge you to come to the next board meeting and ask that. It's certainly relevant around budgeting and priorities and how we're allocating expenses. Igor, you have a question?
Yeah, just a second. I want to show myself too. Yeah. Okay, good evening. I just want to add an additional argument to maybe to keep reserves relatively low, and instead of that, to have several special assessments when we need it. And the reason for that is high inflation environment we have today, and which will last probably until 2025, as the most optimistic scenario, maybe even later. So people are running from cash now. And what is suggested is just to accumulate cash and keep it for years before we actually spend it. So we're going to lose a lot of money just because of inflation. And why don't we keep reserves relatively low for the next several years and collect money for each project which requires additional funding, like next Prime Touch project next summer, like they usually start in August and ends it in October, so it's almost a year from now. So we will know exactly how much do they need. We will collect this money and immediately spend them. So I think the best approach now, because of this high inflation environment, will be to collect, immediately spend, collect and spend, not to keep money for a long period of time. Otherwise, we will lose a significant portion of this money. His question.
So Paul, what would be the pros and cons of an approach like that? I assume And there are certainly other communities that do this where they sort of pay as you go and just do frequent assessments.
Yeah, I mean, I think that,
Probably we might have 2-3 assessments a year, but we at least we avoid losing money because of inflation. Yeah, and we know
I-
exactly how much do we need. We don't know now how much we will need next year, even for snow removal, for repairs, for everything. We don't know. We need to, yeah, what you propose is to accumulate extra money. Just in case, yeah, to carry, to cover everything we might need next year, year after the next one. So, but I think it would be more efficient for us just to collect money immediately when we need them and immediately spend them for that specific project.
Got it. Thank you, Igor.
all right, I have a few comments on that. One is, it's difficult to collect the money a month before you need to spend it. People may not pay on time. If you have special assessments, you have less of a, as I understand it, I'm not an attorney, but you have less ability to collect from people if it's a special assessment versus a regular contribution in terms of if there is a bankruptcy or foreclosure. So regular assessments are easier to collect, more certain, and they also help people plan. I mean, one of the goals of the reserve study is to have a sustainable and predictable financial future for the association and for the owners. So if you know that your fee is going to go up 3.5% per year, and there are these special assessments in the first year or 2 or 6 or whatever, you can budget. If you wait until you know exactly what the cost is of something and then say we need $100,000, that's logistically very difficult to do. And getting the money before it needs to be paid is difficult. And also it's an issue of fairness. Everybody should be paying their fair share every year. And if you wait until a 20-year component has to be replaced and you try and collect the money in year 19, the people in year 1 through 18 haven't contributed to it. So it's really not a fair situation. I understand what you're saying about inflation and that money loses its value when it's sitting in your account, but unless you're a great investor, it's going to be losing money in your, purchasing power in your account potentially as well. So I think it's not a very practical approach. And I'm going through this with another association in Boston, a high-rise building, and they've been assessing as needed, and they're in a big hole. And it's really not a sustainable way of funding the association. You need to know that the money's going to be there so you can negotiate larger projects with qualified vendors and get the job done. If you need to go out every time to get money, it's just, I don't think it's a very practical way to run it. So I would not be in favor of that.
But we were using this approach for the last years, for many years before now, and it worked well. And for example, several years ago, we had a special assessment for snow removal because we had too much snow that season, and we didn't face any problem with collecting extra money. It was significant. Yeah, so, my point is that it might be less convenient comparing to just collecting a lot of money right now and keeping them. It's understandable, but we're going to lose significant portion of money. And the inflation rate today.
Igor, thank you, appreciate it. I think we got that point, and I got a ton of other people I have to get to. But
Okay,
thank you very much.
you.
Got the point. We have a comment in the chat. Does the zero balance in the reserves include cash that was in the reserves?
I guess I can answer that. I would say yes and no. So we have, I don't know the exact number, Peter, maybe Peter's better, approximately $600,000 in cash.
At the end of October, we had $700,000 in cash. We also had obligations to Prime Touch for $800,000. So but that is an obligation that will be paid off over the next 2 years. So we have cash, so we're not in a cash crunch, even though our reserve balance is negative by about $100,000+ at the moment, but we do not have a cash crunch at all.
Thank you.
And the second part of that question, also, why have decisions been made to do some nice to have items like personal fences when there are other big budget items? That's another question about specific spending allocations priorities that we talk about on the December 8th meeting. And I urge you to come and ask that question then. And Stephanie has a question.
Hi
Go ahead,
everyone.
Steph.
Hi everyone. Actually, I'm using my wife's Zoom account. So my name is Yang, and I have 2 questions. The first question is, for the assessment report, I know the expense projection is the probably most important driver for the reserve fund. So meaning like the useful life projection could impact the reserve fund significantly. So when I read the report, I noticed that some of the useful life, for example, the roads, the parking lots, are estimated at like 20 to 25 years. But there are roads in our area that last 35 years. So I just want to say, things like that, it seems to be a very conservative approach to estimate the expense, meaning it might be overstated. So for the report, is there any way that we can see, the scenario, like a less conservative scenario, so everyone can contribute less, or like a more conservative scenario, then we need more fund to get a more comfortable level? That's my first question. The second question is, when it approaches the useful end of the useful life, we assume the way to solve the issue is to repair, to replace, for example, replace the roof, or repave the whole road. But is there any way, like maybe we can just repair it instead of redo everything? Otherwise, it'll require more money to spend on those stuff. And last, I also want to echo Igor's comments earlier. Instead of we get more funds for the next 20 or 30 years, maybe it might make more sense to we do the special assessment when we really need it. Otherwise, if we really have a lot of money or the cash in the bank account, it's really easy to spend that. Or I'm saying in a good way, but it might be more cautious for us to spend the money on different projects if we can do the special assessment when we really need it. And Paul mentioned about the fairness, but I think when it comes to the special assessment, even you want to sell the unit, you still need to take care of the special assessment before you sell it. So I think it's not really about the fairness, and also about the timing. At least we can project the next year's spending, and if we need more cash for next year's spending, maybe we can do a special assessment, for that year instead of for the longer period, for 20 years. So that's all my question.
Thank you very much.
So
Paul,
I guess for me, it's a little easier if you ask fewer questions in a row, but I was writing them down, so I think I got them all. So in terms of, I think what I would say that if there's, one of your last points was if there's a lot of money in the reserve fund, the board or the community may be tempted to buy something new rather than save that money for replacing something when it should be replaced. And typically there are rules within the condominium documents for new items versus replacing what's there. So, I mean, that should be investigated, but that's certainly a valid point. That should not happen. As far as, if you know there's an assessment coming in 10 years for the roof. So some associations don't plan that too far in advance, but some of them do take a minimal approach. And then in the reserve study, there is an assessment of a projected amount 10 years in the future. So that if you hand that reserve study to somebody, they'll know that, all right, if I buy and it's year 9, I'm going to expect to pay extra in that following year. The problem with deciding every year whether you need a special assessment and whatever the size is going to be is I would disagree with you that that's not fair, because if it's done for things that are predictable but just not collected and it's not known to everyone, then someone's going to get hit with an assessment the year after they move in for roofs that should have been saved for 20 years. So that it can be done in a fair way, but it needs to be planned well in advance. And the idea that you can collect money a few months before you need it, or even the year before you need it, from everybody at a huge amount, I don't think is realistic. But so that's just a comment on that. As far as when you get close to the end of a useful life for a component, I mentioned that the board should really be looking at 5-year in kind of a rolling 5-year time period as you go along. And as something drops into that 5th year from now time period, let's say it's a road or a roof or a piece of equipment, that's the time to start talking to the service contractors and saying, is this look like it's still going to need to be replaced in 5 years, or I come out again and take a look at it, or what can be done to extend the life of the roof, or whatever the component is. So it's something that if the board uses the reserve study, which can really become the archival document for the community, and say, all right, well, we hopefully have somebody look at the roofs every year and do some minor repairs. And if you do that, then probably the useful life can be increased a little bit. And it's a balancing act. I mean, you don't want to be under conservative. So I'm looking at the asphalt on Bishop's Forest Drive. I think this is an example that will address what your question was. So typically, I budget 20 years to replace a road. And in many places, that's too long. It really depends on what's under the road, how much of the base coat they put in, and what the soil conditions are in the area that you are in. It's amazing that for the scheduled replacement of Bishop's Forest Drive, it will be 36 years old. That's great. Now for the next go around, I assumed 25 years. So maybe that's too conservative, but as time goes on, 5 years after the replacement, if it still looks good, or 10 years after the replacement, it looks good. If you're updating your reserve study, you can push that into the future as you go along. It would be probably, not a good idea from a prediction point of view. From my point of view, what if the asphalt mix is, there are reasons why it might not last 25, might only last 25 years. So if you're updating your study, I think you can update those remaining lives as you go on. So I think that addresses all of your questions.
Yeah, so my point is it could be the other way, like now you collect the money and then later on you decide, okay, maybe we don't have to replace the road for another 5 years. You can push the useful life, but but when you have the cash, I'm not saying the associate will overspend the money. What I'm saying that if they say the concept in conceptual, conceptually, when it comes to the end of the useful life, then they probably start considering replace the items.
Sure.
Instead of if
You muted.
Oh, I'm sorry, you just got muted.
Move on. Are you gonna?
I'm sorry, do you want to unmute yourself?
We can't hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
There you
yeah,
go.
I'm not sure like where I was like muted, but
So
I
anyway,
do,
yeah.
I think we got the point.
Yeah.
Very much appreciate the comments. Thank you. We have another comment in the chat. Can we have multiple options as to how we would pay an assessment? I think really briefly, Peter, do you want to address in the past when there have been other assessments, there's been multiple ways to do this. How have we done it in the past?
We can, it can be, depending upon the size of it, it could be a one-time payment. It could be spread out over 6 months to a year, or as some of Paul's proposals were, an assessment that might be split over 2 or 3 years. So this will be one of the issues that the board will be considering very deeply over the next month as to having determined how much we need to collect. Then the second part is how do we go about collecting it? So there are multiple options on that.
Thank you. We have a question from Elaine.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for all your hard work.
You're welcome.
So obviously, the 2014 Paul's study today is referring to work being budgeted into the future of 2035 and 2052. The 2014 reserve study must have projected into the future. Now, we've been here since early 2015, January, and the roads weren't done, the tennis court wasn't done. So obviously, those that work had been projected in that 2014 reserve study. So my question is, and obviously the prior boards, we haven't had any assessments that I know of. So they've just deferred all that work, at least since 2014. And I'm curious, what guarantees do we have if we are assessed this money and our fees go up, that any of the work is actually going to get done within the next few years, or it's just going to be deferred again and again?
yeah, I mean, I don't think it would be in anyone's interest in terms of the board or the community to collect money and then not spend it on things that need to be done. But that's really kind of beyond the scope of what I do. But
Well, I mean, every board obviously has their own discretionary power. So what's the guarantee that, the road is actually going to be paved, or that the other tennis court's going to be done? I don't really understand. Why wasn't any of it done in 2014? But since 2014, were all the prior reserve studies ignored?
Well, no, I would say that there's been a considerable amount of work done since 2014. We've, obviously the current roofing and siding cycle we've paved.
I know, but that's
nearly half.
That's
nearly
a
half
scheduled
of
maintenance with Prime Touch.
not the roofing. No, the roofing was added in 2018, 2019. That was something that was done. There wasn't even, I guess it was in the reserve study, but it's something that we actually pulled in a little bit early to kind of cycle in with the painting and the siding times. But we've done a considerable amount of work, and most of it was in the previous reserve study. I think the previous reserve study underestimated a lot of the costs of, certainly of the paving. When we ended up doing the paving in Woodbury and in Highlands, the overall cost of that was considerably higher than what was estimated in the reserve study.
yeah, and paving costs are very, very difficult to predict, because if you think about what you've paid for a gallon of gasoline over the last 2 years, it's doubled. And now it's in the middle. So that's another reason to update the study over time, so that you can take into account what's going on with the market for the various materials that you're using.
And as Paul said, it's in no one's interest to have deteriorating roads and siding that doesn't look good, or roofs that leak. That's in no one's best interest. And I would say, we corrected the front entrance with the bricks, considerably earlier than what was anticipated, because the bricks were a maintenance nightmare, and the pavers, the front entrance pavers were a maintenance nightmare. So, we've done some stuff that could have waited. It was scheduled to wait until we repaved the whole road. So we've done some work early too. Thank you.
Elaine, does that answer your question?
It does. I guess it doesn't really answer the question about what guarantees do we have that the deferred work, and by that I'm referring to like the pool deck and the fencing around the worker shed and the bridge and all of those things that clearly were deteriorating in 2014 or beyond. How do we know those are really going to be done?
Well, Elaine, your lack of trust in the board's discretion hurts me personally. Of course, since Elaine is my wife. Okay.
You can see. So I donate you to the board, but I don't want to donate money to it. Okay,
All right.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
All right, thank you.
We have lots of comments. I'll try to catch up on some from the chat. In the past years, we've always had a surplus in the operational budget that at least in part have been put into the reserve. Will that be true this year?
I think Peter.
Yeah, my current estimate is that our budget for this year will be positive, but only by a small amount, something in the 20 to 30,000 range. And you're correct. We've managed to save a lot of money in the operational budget over the last few years, and that's always been turned over into the reserve account. But it's going to be a tough budget going forward because of the inflation issues that have been talked about in the past.
Got it. Same commenter asks, also, why have we redone the BF-BF2 agreement over the last 4 years to charge them less when they wrote the original and other rewrite in their favor, thus costing BF unit owners more? Is the board's fiduciary responsibility to BF or BF2? Those are great questions, and questions we've dealt with time and time again in these meetings, and questions we would be happy to deal with again at the next meeting, but are not relative to the reserve study. So these meetings, by the way, every board meeting, not only used to be that you couldn't really attend them, you had to rely on the meeting minutes. During COVID, we went to putting them on video so you could participate and view them directly, and they are on YouTube TV. So if you miss a meeting, you can go and watch it. And those meetings are available to you. But please, on December 8th, come and ask that question, because believe me, we're all dying to answer. It seems like previous budgets have reflected a substantial reserve. Was that reserve depleted in the course of the last year?
Well, the last couple of years, the year-end forecast had been in the 200,000 range, so I would not call them substantial reserves. This year has been especially challenging because of cost and the fact that we pulled some work on the roofing program forward.
Okay. A comment: you cannot have continuous special assessments. It would have a very negative effect on the perception of Bishop's Forest. Buyers of condos do look at reserves. Another comment: 10 years from now, inflation will eat away at least 30%. I got the message that Carol Werner can't raise her hand. Carol, I'll find you and unmute you in a minute. Another comment: we have a debt to Prime Touch of $300K after increases. Are we free of debt with Prime Touch, and will we stop building up that debt again?
That's what is probably just, I mean.
At the end of the year, we'll have a debt to Prime Touch of approximately $500,000. We're paying that off at $60,000 a month.
Another comment: some years ago, we were advised that our reserve fund was in good shape. How did we get to zero? Peter, you're on a roll.
Okay. Again, the funds were in decent shape, but they weren't in as good shape as we thought they were. We're just in the midst of a $4.5 million roofing program at a time we were collecting between $400,000 and $500,000 per year in reserve contributions. That math does not equate. This is part of what the reserve study we're doing right now addresses.
So imagine too that if our last reserve study was perfect, and if we followed it perfectly, we just went through COVID, inflation, staffing issues, supply chain meltdown. Any homeowners association that isn't having these kinds of budget issues and forecasting issues right now, it's really unimaginable. This would be the most difficult time probably in our lifetimes to have to forecast these kinds of issues. Another comment, reserves are usually 15 to 40% of expenses. With the inflation, should we keep a lower percentage, 15 to 20%? This would be like what Igor is suggesting. If we needed more, we could do additional funding, but the 15 to 20 would give us a balance of funds available.
This year is actually, in 2022, 1/3 of our overall budget was for the reserves. That's actually increased from what it had been 3 years ago, 25%. So a 15 or 20% number, which sounds good, would not provide sufficient funds for reserve expenditures going forward.
Another question, are we going to discuss the options for the assessments? We're getting the recommendations from Paul in his report today. We will on December 8th at our budget meeting be taking input from unit owners and discussing options then. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's good.
In the past, the board gave a discount to anyone who paid the full assessment up front. Is that being considered this time? It is definitely being considered. We're looking at a bunch of different options for how we would move forward and how would we make this as convenient and easy for people to deal with. Another one, do I understand that the study said that the main road was done 36 years ago? We've been here since 1998, and I believe the main road has been paved since we've been here.
1990.
I don't believe so.
It has been repaired.
Repaired, but not replaced. It's been patched.
I've only been here 10 years, so I can't come, but there's two different possibility, right? So you lay down the main road or a base layer, and then you put another asphalt layer on top of it. So what we've seen when we did Highlands and when we did Woodbury is there was two separate layers there. So the original layer was there. They kind of took off, an inch or an inch and a half, and they put another layer on top. What we've been doing is going back down to the base layer. So they may have come through and kind of milled off. It's called milling. They take off the top inch or so, and then just kind of resurface it, and that gives you an extra 10, 15 years. I have no idea. I know that was the case in Highlands and in Woodbury, but for the main road, I don't know. It very possibly could be original, or it was possibly milled and redone 20 years ago. I have no idea.
We have a question from Joe.
Yes, thank you. It's my understanding that if you're out to sell your unit and the special assessment has been announced that year, you're responsible for paying that special assessment. Is that true if the assessment has been announced for several years going forward as well?
Yes.
I honestly can't answer that. I mean, we have, there's discussion and Paul's presented some options that includes an assessment, but without I guess an official letter going out to the unit owners to tell you what an assessment is or would be, I don't know that would necessarily hold true. I'm honestly not sure. I'm not a real estate agent.
Bob might be able to take this, but I do believe there is a big difference between there has been an assessment and we've sent you the bill and we plan to do another assessment. So I believe if we build you for it.
Let me rephrase the question, if I may. If we go, I don't know which option it is, but one of the options is a $2 million assessment in 23 a 1 million assessment in 24,
Oh, I see, because he's doing
And if-
individual assessment.
and a $500,000 assessment in 25. If that option is chosen, are we then responsible for the 3.5 million assessment going forward?
It's one assessment over.
I think that's a
Well,
legal question, and it's probably
Yeah, but-
something that is negotiated between the buyer and the sellers, is my logical opinion. But
Yeah, I'm not a real estate agent.
Bob, do you have?
I
a comment on that?
unmuted myself. It is up to the unit owner and the buyer to negotiate. Sometimes it's the unit owner who will pay it all. Sometimes it's the buyer. Sometimes you build it into the cost of your unit, but it is a negotiation between the two.
But the law says the
We should not get into, we're not going to give, non-lawyers here are not going to give legal advice on, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot that. Yes.
And a real estate agent.
Oh, all right, well then, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No,
The
no
law,
mayor
the
on the
law-
board should be giving legal advice. That's
But-
not his function.
okay.
Good question, though.
Yeah, very good question. Just a second. Some reserve studies are done every few years, and I doubt any of us will be here in 30 years. Would it be more realistic to do a 20 to 25 year projection and thus do smaller assessments over the next few years? Paul?
well, the 30-year time period is pretty much the de facto standard that most people use. It does. I don't think it would have a huge impact to go to 25 years. There are certain components that have a 25 or 30-year lifetime. If you just miss it in the reserve study, it depends on how you organize the funding plan, whether you're still saving toward it or not. Depends which technique you use. I don't think that's really, I would highly recommend the 30-year time period. It gives you a good long-term view. Certainly from 10 to 20 and from 20 to 30 are more uncertain than the next 10 years. But I think it gives you a good overview. I would not recommend changing it.
What is the cost impact of moving the Morningside painting up a year versus keeping it to its original schedule?
That's probably better for the December meeting. But we were looking at the degradation in the materials, that the fading and the paint wear and the potential cost increases of having to do additional siding if we let it go and the siding started to dry out.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend painting those buildings soon.
Thank you. We have a question from Brian.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much. And thanks everybody for the time and effort that went into putting all this together. I really have more of a comment. The question of fairness has come up a couple of times, and I just wanted to make a quick comment on that. First, the word fairness is a very heavy value-laden word, and in the description the engineer gave, he said, it wouldn't be fair, right, if to let these costs wait. But if you think about somebody that bought when Bishop's Forest was new, and assume everything's got a 20-year life and you were paying 1/20th every year, and you sold at 19.5 years, you would have paid for all that work twice, right? So that's just my way of saying, I think we have to be very careful about this concept of what's fair, right? Because these investments are going to that we make, which are important, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do them. Of course we should. They accrue to the owners who stick around and to the future owners, which is why, to me, the idea of trying to fully fund, which I don't think is where we'll wind up, seems a bit aggressive. There's got to be some balance between putting the burden on the people who are going to enjoy those investments and the people who are living through the depreciation of those investments. So it's just something I think needs to be considered. We obviously need to deal with the reserve issue. I'm certainly in favor of whatever assessments we need. But I'm curious if people have reactions to this, but that to suggest it's not fair to fully fund these things, I think kind of misses the entire point, because we paid for the value. when we bought our homes. And that's an important thing to consider.
So I guess, Brian, I have a question. I mean, yes, you know, if you bought originally, you paid for a new roof. And then if you live in Bishop's Forest for 19 years and you've paid 1/19 of the roof into the fund, and then you leave, then the person who buys the unit buys a 19-year-old roof. They put in 1 year and they get a new roof, and they stay there for 5 more years and they pay for the next 5 years of depreciation. So the next person that moves in has 15 more years. I don't understand the logic of the unfairness.
The logic is actually it's really more an objection to the argument that there's something inherently fair about fully funding and straight line depreciating these assets and replacement costs, right? You've paid for them, you get to enjoy them. Obviously, we can't just wait till the last minute and deal with it all then, but nor is it necessarily appropriate. Nor is fully funding necessarily the appropriate definition of fair here, right? So, and I don't think there's an answer, by the way. Therefore, it's a judgment call as to what extent do we prepay, reserve these expenses, and to what extent do we pay as we go? Yeah, at the moment with zero reserves, we're in pure pay as we go. That's not good enough, right? But fully funding it, is an extreme. And not one that I would call fairer than, say, doing half that, right? There's just judgment there is all I'm saying.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Kwan, you have a question. I know I just did your question in the chat. Do you have a different one, or did we already cover you?
Yeah, I do have a different question.
Great.
So, hi guys, thank you so much for organizing this, and thank you for your presentation. I do have questions like, suppose like we connect this money for the special assessment, but for some reason in the future we don't spend it as planned for. So will this money directly go to the reserve fund? And if it is, will it help to lower the future years condo fee?
I would say it would be a balancing act.
Well, Paul, do you want to address how that?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
I mean, like, suppose you try to connect the money for the special assessment, and you plan for some project in 5 years, but at the end of the 5th year, you don't spend the money. Maybe the project doesn't need to be finished at that time. We defer that one, and those money will go to the reserve fund, right?
So if we collect funds for a special project and they do not get expended upon that project, what happens to those funds? Do they go to the reserve, or how would that be handled?
What happens if the money is not being spent for a particular project?
Gotcha.
So that, that would be a board decision, I suppose. If you end up with a project that costs a little less than was projected, then that money, I would imagine, would stay in the reserve fund, but.
Right. Yeah, it would stay in the reserve fund, but I think practically you would then reduce the amount you collect for in the future. And that's the way you would, by rebalancing what our needs are, you're indicating if the needs are less, what would you do? You would then reduce the rate of collections from the unit owners.
But it's really a hypothetical scenario that we typically don't see, because when we don't decide just to move forward on an anticipated project, it's because we are short the funds to do it, not because we have the funds and choose not to expend them.
And generally, you're going to have to do that project sooner or later. So if, the roads, right? If you look at the roads, it's going to cost $200,000 to do the roads, this year, but you look at it and say, well, we're good for another 3 or 4 years. You don't give that money back. You just, you have to reallocate that money 3 or 4 years later.
Higher cost, probably.
Possibly at a higher cost.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Cheryl Town has a question.
Just like a comment on what was just said about reducing the fees. Like, I feel like that was almost setting up an expectation that that might ever happen, which I think we're all pretty well aware that will never happen, that fees will not ever be reduced, which brings me to, I was going to raise my hand before about it, but you said you were going to be discussing at the next meeting the correlation between the special assessment and the amount of fees, the increase percentage year over year. So since I moved in 2 years ago, my fees have gone up every year. Looking at this projection, fees are still going to continue to go up every year. So I guess my question is, on top of the assessment, and my fees are going up as part of that 3.5% going towards like the reserve part of it. Like, and I think someone raised this before, I don't know how quite to say it, but would it be better to just have this assessment and not have fees go up as much, because we all know that they never go back down once they get an increase? And so I think you said you discuss it at the next meeting. Or
Yeah, that's really a policy
or
decision.
are we going to discuss it now or something? Yeah, so I don't understand where that.
No, I mean, unless Paul has some best practices, I mean, other than that, yeah, that'll be discussed next month.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of having fees go up a small amount every year allows people to plan effectively for their financial situation. That's not the way all associations do it. Sometimes, it'll be fixed for several years and then it'll go up a large amount, and it's kind of unpredictable. That's really a philosophy that the association has to decide how they want to do it.
So you're saying the norm is to go up a little bit every year just to keep up with inflation?
That's
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just asking. Yeah,
No,
is that normally the
That would
norm?
be a board, so that would be a board decision.
Yeah.
I think probably best practices, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, would probably be to keep up with the level of inflation. But
yeah,
that is discretionary. Now, the board at any point could say, gee, a couple of things we anticipated didn't cost as much, and we're in a better situation financially, so we don't need fees to go up. I think it's unlikely to get to a situation where you see fees going down, but it is certainly, there's a potential for being in a situation where fees do not go up. Because they don't need to.
And I don't want to get too much, again, this is really more of a discussion for next month, but with Peter's been working on the operational budget, and we've been able to pretty well hold the line on the operational budget over the last couple of years.
Does that answer your question, Cheryl?
yeah. I just was looking for the norm, and I just was surprised when someone was actually saying requesting the fees might go down, and then Peter said yes, of course they would if we had extra money, which
that's right,
is not likely. But okay, thank you.
Thank you. From the chat, after increasing funding to Bishop's Forest, why is Prime Touch debt increasing? Don't we want to pay for our annual expenses when we get it?
I'd say that's a December, but we've done a lot of work. They did a lot more work this year than previous years, but that's really more of a December.
And actually, it's a little bit more of a complicated answer, because there are some benefits to the way that expense is funded. But ask that again in December. Before we figure increases, should we not look at saving money from other big expenses and operations, landscaping, water, pool? That's another December comment and our question, and it makes perfect sense. Another comment, agree with Brian, fairness, there is no such thing. Pay as you go is the closest thing to fairness. Another comment, Rich was correct. Main Road, it was initially patched, then top coated. You've been validated. Another comment, this year you used reserve money to increase and do future spending this year. This uses up the money for another project. I'm not sure I understand that. This year you used reserve money.
Probably that we brought in the one or two buildings, the remaining buildings in Highlands, we brought them in this year versus going back and finishing it up next year. And again, that goes to the painting cycle as well. Right now, I think we're on, I've kind of lost track, I'm sorry, either the 8th or 9th year for Highlands painting. I forget if I think this is the 8th year. So if we let it go another year, it would be into the 9th year for that painting cycle on Highlands.
Another December thing, but last thing I'll say on that is it actually saved us money that we did that. Reserve studies are fairly accurate for 5 to 10 years. After that, they are best used to see what needs to be planned, but not for an accurate cost. Paul, you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I agree. And that's why you need to update more frequently than you have in the past.
Agreed. And there is no one else with their hand up. There is one more question I held to the end. One question was, what are the next steps at this point? The process was, we get the reserve study by an expert outside third party. We get comments from unit owners on that study. We're going to review that study, and we have been and look at options for the budget for the coming year. We meet on December 8th to get further input from unit owners on that budget, and we will deliberate and make decisions at that point. So that's the process. Paul, anything else in closing?
No, well, thank you. It's been an interesting meeting with good questions. So
thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul.
thank you, Paul. You're
Thank you
very
very
welcome.
much. We appreciate your time.
And before everybody starts dropping off, let me
Right.
just say, this is more people than we usually have for a meeting like this. We do have these meetings every month. I know they're not all quite this exciting, but if you've got questions, concerns, you want to know what's going on, drop in there or catch them on Bishop's Forest TV on the YouTube channel. Search for Bishop's Forest TV, you'll find it there. And we do endeavor to answer these questions, take in comments and suggestions, and improve things as we go. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much and good night.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, everyone. So this is not ending the evening's festivities. We're going to take a probably 2 to 3 minute break so the board can kind of regroup, and then we'll go into the trustee meeting. We'll keep it here on this Zoom channel. So all 52 of you, don't go running away yet. We have hours of entertainment left.
Well, 51,
Paul, if you're still there, thank you very much.